Good evening to everyone. Tonight we're starting a new series. We're going to be going over the next several weeks through the book of Genesis. What we decided to do is we're actually going to follow the outline. We're not just going to be reading or telling the stories in the same form, but we're actually following the outline of stories that's found in a children's Bible storybook that's called the Biggest Story Bible Storybook. I think a few of you might have this with your children. It's one that, we've had several children's Bibles over the years that we've read with the kids, and I've been very impressed with this one. If you're an artsy person, you'll probably like this. It's got some very neat pictures. Kids like the pictures in there. It's very well done. But the actual stories, the way that they're told and the way that they're designed to fit the story of the Bible together, to point the story towards God and towards Jesus, I've been very impressed with. I thought it's a very good Bible storybook for reading with kids, and so I've enjoyed it. They've come out with all sorts of curriculums and other things, but we're just going to follow the segments that it has, at least through Genesis. Now, it has a curriculum that goes through 2 years worth of weekly studies, but we're just going to start off with Genesis, and we may come back for other parts of the Old Testament. But if you're a parent and want to look into this with your kids, it's a good one to read. In the weekly emails, I'll be sending out some more information, links to videos and podcasts that you can listen to the chapters, and they've got activities and all sorts of things. But that's just a bit of a background of how we're going through this series. So we'll be going through Genesis. Now, I feel like at the beginning of this, especially given how we're doing this, and I'll admit it felt a little weird to me. I liked the book when I suggested it to the teachers and we discussed it, but even still, it feels a little weird for me to say that we're basing a teaching series off of a children's storybook, but I do think it's worthwhile. But that brings up something I want to talk about at the very onset of this, of the idea of the Bible as a story. Now, I don't know what you think of when you hear the word story, but there's different ideas, and many times when we think of a story, especially when we think of children's storybooks, we often think of imaginary things, we think of make-believe, and certainly all of us that are reading books to our kids at night, there's a lot of silly books, there's talking bears, and there's talking animals, and there's all sorts of things that are make-believe stories, and because of that, some people don't like the idea of children's Bible storybooks. Some people don't even like to refer to things, events in the Bible as a story. I've known people that are uncomfortable with children's storybooks because they feel like it makes the Bible on the same level as these silly, funny storybooks that we read our kids. And that's an understandable concern and something to think about. And let me say right now, not all children's Bible storybooks are created equal. There are some out there that are not very good, or so light, or add too much. And then there are some that I think are very well. But then just the idea of a story. And I think that story is an important concept within Scripture. Now, I may be biased because since I was a kid, I've loved stories. I've loved Bible stories. I've loved fictional stories. I've loved lessons that teach on stories. I love to read fictional literature that's stories. I enjoy stories. And so maybe I'm a bit biased towards this, but I think that God created us as people that are storytelling people and story-hearing people. Think of how much information gets passed along in stories. Think of how much we consume stories. Now, we don't sit around and listen to people tell stories like perhaps they've done throughout most of human history, but we sit down to a television screen and we watch a story. We go to a play and we see a story. We have musicals that tell stories. We are people that thrive on stories. And I think there's a reason for that. I think God created us as storytelling and story-hearing individuals, partly because He is a storytelling God. And a story does not have to be fictional. Stories are true. They can be. Think of the word history. The word story is right there in the word. I don't know the official etymology of the word history, but what is history? It is the story of the past. It is the retelling, hopefully factual, of the events that have happened. And we recognize that stories are real all the time. You know, one of my favorite things when I get to travel with preaching meetings and across the country, I get to meet lots of people at different congregations. And one of my favorite things is getting to hear people who have converted to the church, or I hear people who grew up in the church and they left, and 20, 30 years later they came back. And I've heard some pretty amazing conversion stories. I've heard some pretty amazing stories about people and how they came to know the Lord and came to the church. And sometimes I'll say, that's a great story. And when I say that, I'm not saying that's make-believe, and I don't think that, but it was nice. I mean, that story is powerful. Telling those events has meaning and purpose and power, and I appreciate hearing it, and I appreciate sometimes getting to retell it. We are storytelling people, and the Bible is a story. It's not a myth, it's not a legend, it's not an allegory, but isn't it amazing that of all the ways an all-powerful God could communicate who he is to us and could communicate what he wants from us, that he chose to do so vastly through stories. Think about the Bible for a second. I had to look this up. I have to trust this to a degree, but I read one site that said roughly 43% of the Bible is what you would call narrative. That's a story. So like when we read Genesis and it's telling us about what's happening, that's a narrative. Over 40% of the Bible is narrative. That tells us something about how God communicated the message. Also, we find stories across all genres. While there's other genres than just narrative, we find stories in the other genres as well. Think of the poetic literature, the wisdom literature. How does the book of Job open? Now, the book of Job's a strange book. It's difficult to read. It's this discussion. The vast majority of it is this discussion between Job and his friends. But how do we understand? How do we frame that conversation? The book of Job opens with what? One of the most amazing stories in the Bible. How Satan and God have a discussion, and God allows Satan to go and hurt Job. It's a story. Think of Jonah. Jonah's a book of prophecy. It's one of the prophets. But Jonah and the whale is one of the most well-known Bible stories there is. Daniel's a book of prophecy, and the first several chapters are narrative. We find narrative throughout poetry and prophecy. It's always there. Think of the way Jesus taught. One of Jesus' primary methods of teaching was parables. What are parables? Parables are stories. They are real-to-life stories. He would use examples, and some of these may have been made up. Some of these may have been things he witnessed. Some of these things may have been things he knew about. But he would communicate eternal gospel truths through relatable stories, because stories have power. They help people understand. They help people relate. They help reach the inner part of man. And so I say all that to say, I think that we need to have an appreciation for Bible stories. Sometimes, especially when I've traveled, I'll mention a Bible story, and I'll have some very well-intentioned brother or sister say afterwards, I don't like to call things Bible stories. I always say that account or that narrative. And I used to think, well, yeah, maybe I need, but now I think, no, it's a Bible story. We just need to appreciate what a story is. And we need to build our lives around these stories. Remember what Deuteronomy tells parents to do with their children, to tell them of the Word of God and the law of God when they wake up and when they go to bed. How do you think they did that? Now, they didn't have a nice hardbound, Crossway published Bible storybook, but they told the stories. They told their children about the chapters we're going to talk about tonight. They told their children about that time when they witnessed God part the Red Sea. They told their children the stories of who God is and what God wants. And that should be our homes and our lives. What is the gospel? It's the story of what God has done for us, the good news told in the story, the real story of Jesus. And so I want to just begin, I wanted to take a few minutes there to talk about the story of the Bible and how I think we should appreciate it And so hopefully that makes a bit more sense. If you were wondering why we would go through following the outline of a storybook, maybe that puts you a bit more at ease. Now, something about every story is every story has a beginning. And tonight, that's where we're starting, is the beginning of the story that is the biblical story. And this is the other reason I want to start off with that, because I want us to think about Genesis 1 and 2 and what's the purpose of those chapters. Is Genesis 1 and 2 an introduction to a story, or is it a science textbook? Don't get me wrong, I believe in the literal account that we find in Genesis 1 and 2. I believe that creation is the way that the earth got here, the way that we got here. I do not believe that life just accidentally happened. I don't believe that we've evolved over millions and billions of years. I believe the story, I believe the accounts of Genesis 1 and 2. But with the rise of evolutionary thought and atheism in Western society, I think one of the reactions from Christians or Bible-believing people has been to look at Genesis 1 and 2 more as a science textbook than as an introduction to the biblical story. And I think part of that is a reaction against evolution. And I do think that we need to combat evolutionary thought. I think that we need to defend the biblical account. But if all we look to Genesis 1 and 2 for is as a counter against evolutionary thought, then we're probably missing really what those chapters are there for in the first place. Think of when Moses wrote these, which, by the way, this is a couple thousand years after the events take place, when Moses finally is inspired to write down Genesis 1 and 2 and the rest of the Pentateuch. Now, you probably didn't have evolutionists back then, but you did have other religious groups. You had Egyptians and Canaanites that had their own creation stories that they would tell. And so this would be putting the record straight in a sense. But those people weren't denying the existence of a God or gods that created the world. This was telling the truth about the God who created the world. And that's important because who created the world and why he created the world and how he created us has a tremendous impact on who we are and what we're doing and how we can possibly find fulfillment in this life and what our purpose is. And so those are the reasons I think that Moses was inspired by God to write the story of how it all began. Not just to prove the Egyptians wrong or the Canaanites wrong about how the world was created, but the purpose behind man's existence and who this God is that created us. And so I think we need to look for that. And when we look at it that way, then we begin to, I think, see some of the meaning that becomes the foundation for the whole biblical narrative. Again, I think that we combat evolutionary thought, but I'm assuming most of us in here, hopefully all of us, believe in creation. And so surely there's more here for us than just God created the world. It didn't happen by evolution. There's greater meanings, and hopefully we'll be able to draw a few of those out or at least mention them in our lesson this evening. And so we come to Genesis 1 and 2, and before we dive into the events, I just want to go over an outline. This is the way I outline these first two chapters, because admittedly, it's a little strange when you start off with Genesis 1 verse 1, and then you go into Genesis 1 verse 2. In fact, that's led to some different theories out there. But I think what's happening in Genesis 1 through 2 is you've got three layers of detail. You've got, first of all, Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is the creation statement. This is as simple as it gets. How did we get here? God. Who created us? God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That statement covers everything else that comes in chapters 1 and 2. You could stop there if you wanted, and that's the really big bird's eye view. But then, starting in verse 2, we dive into that statement a little bit more. And from verse 2 through chapter 2, verse 3, then we go through the days of creation, and it tells us about each day and what God created and what God thought of that. And so we then have this kind of zoomed in view on the actual days of creation. And then from verse 4 of chapter 2 through the end of that chapter, we have a zooming in again, specifically to day 6, and specifically to the creation of man and why God did some of the things that he did, and some of the special uniqueness about man is expounded. It's mentioned in the end of chapter 1, but it's expanded upon in chapter 2. And so you don't have, I think, in Genesis 1, God created the heavens and the earth, and then verse 2 is a continuation of that thought. Some people think there's this gap there, or there's this different age. I don't think that's what's happening. I think verse 1 is the statement. We zoom in, and then we zoom in some more in chapter 2. And so let's just go through what we read about there. For time's sake, I'm not going to read Genesis 1 and 2. I'm trusting that hopefully you've been able to read it on your own before now, where you can go home and read it, or you've read through that section of the storybook. But we're just going to kind of go through this fairly briefly. So, where the story begins is, of course, where most stories would begin. Well, actually, let me correct that. Most stories don't begin here. I think this is where the Bible is such a unique story. Most stories begin something along the cliche way of, a long time ago. Of course, the famous Star Wars line, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. A lot of fairy tales and stories begin a long time ago. But the Bible doesn't just take us a long time ago. It takes us to the beginning. In the beginning, God. And we have what God does, but I think if you stop even just there, there's something powerful that we read within just the first 4 words of the Bible. In the beginning, God. We only understand existence in time. That's all we've ever lived in, is an existence that has time. With an earth that's circling the sun and it's spinning around, and we have days and we have hours and minutes and seconds and nanoseconds, and mankind gets better and better at being able to calculate and tabulate and count the time, but we're always in time. But there was a time, ironically enough, when there was no such thing as time. When time as we know it did not exist. But then there was a point when time began. And that was what we would call the beginning. But the beginning, for what we know of this material universe, was not the beginning for God. Because God already was when time began. This alone shows us something about God. It, one, opens up the mysterious nature of God. It immediately begins to show us that God is something far greater, far different than us. For a being to exist outside of time, before time, is something very, very different than us. Now, maybe this brings up questions in our mind. What is an eternal being like? I don't know. My mind right now can't grasp that. I hope to understand that in eternity. But I can't understand that now. I simply have to trust. What did God do before the beginning? Have you ever wondered that? And the eternity that came before the beginning, which is a weird concept in and of itself, what was God doing? I don't know. Was he bored? I doubt it. He's God. And even before there was the beginning, God had all of his glory and all of his splendor. And we don't know what that was and what that was like. But we don't need to. What we know is that when the world began, God was already there. Why did God create the universe? There's a lot of answers to this question. The Bible hints at some things here and there, but the more I looked at Genesis 1 and 2, I realized it doesn't really state why. It doesn't say in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth because he wanted companionship. It doesn't say God created the heavens and the earth because of love, as we often say, God created us from love, and I think that's true, but that's not stated there. We're just told that he did. And I think part of this truncating of and not giving all the details that we might want, one, shows that this isn't meant to be a textbook that dissects all the ins and outs, but it also is introducing us to God and reminding us how great he is. There are so many things that we can't know. And the only things and the only way we can know God is through whichever means and by whatever means he chooses to reveal himself to us. And so in the beginning, God already was. But in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. God is a creative being. God wanted to create this universe. He wanted to create all of the things within it, and he had the power to do so. Out of nothing. Maybe you've heard the term ex nihilo. That means out of nothing. It's a fancy way of saying that. It's a Latin phrase, I think. God was able to take nothing and create everything. Again, we see something different between God and us. There are some people in this audience who are very artistic. You can take a canvas and some colors and some utensils and make a beautiful painting. There are some people in this building who are very good craftsmen. You can take some lumber and some nails and some tools, and you can craft useful, even beautiful projects. There are people in this audience that are creative in so many ways, but every single one of us shares something in common, and that is all of us have to have something to start with. The greatest artist in the world, the greatest painter in the world can do nothing if there is no canvas and there is no paint. The greatest sculptor in the world can do nothing if there is no clay, if there is no rock, if there is no chisel. But God, with absolutely nothing, can create everything. What an incredible God he truly is. And again, how much greater than us must he be? So this is the statement. God created the heavens and the earth, and we do get a little bit more detail. We begin to go through the days of creation from verse 2 forward. First of all, we find that God created light. Now, something about the way God creates. In every verse, he speaks, he says. God does not have to go to some shop, to some workbench and find a way to create these things. God speaks, and the Word of God creates. God's Word takes on form in whatever way that he desires. And first of all, we find that he creates light. Now, to get onto the technical side and maybe the boring side, what does this mean? I've read some people say this means that the first thing God created was the entire, what you might call electromagnetic spectrum. Think of all of the light waves and the way that light works. God created the theory and the scientific principles behind it. Because it is interesting that the sun and the moon and the stars don't exist yet. The sun, the greatest light source that we know, doesn't exist yet, but light does exist. God, what was the source of the light? We're not told. We're just told that he created light. Then, in the ESV, it says that on the second day, he created the expanse. I believe the King James, this is where you find the firmament. And this is a very debated idea. What is the firmament? What is the expanse? I think one of the best explanations is this is what we might call the atmosphere. As God begins to shape a separation between what is going to be earth, what is going to be our world, and the rest of the universe and its existence. And then on day 3, he calls out of the waters. Somehow there's water there, and I don't know how to explain where the water came from, other than it was part of what God created when he spoke the firmament into existence. But from the waters, it says he calls the dry land to come up. And now we have continents and we have oceans. And upon that dry land, he speaks and vegetation appears. So trees begin to grow, and plants and vegetables and all of the vegetation that makes up the world appears on day 3. Then on day 4, we have the sun and the moon and the stars. Now, you may start to see this. What's interesting, this is a helpful way for me to remember what happened on the days of creation. You have the first 3 days, and they correspond to what happens on the next 3 days. So on day 1, you have light. Day 3 or day 4, you have items that do what? Produce and reflect light. You have the sun, and you have the moon, and you have the stars. And God designs these to give light. He designs these to help his creation, that's going to come a few days later, to be able to tell times and seasons and days and years. So he creates the sun and the moon and all of the stars of the universe. Then on day 5, we have sea life and birds. If he had created the firmament and the atmosphere and the waters, he now fills the waters and the air with sea creatures. The seas become, instead of just empty water, now teeming with sharks and fish and octopus, and everything that's weird looking and beautiful looking is swarming through the seas, things that perhaps are long extinct now, that were wondrous and incredible. And he fills the skies with all sorts of birds and flying creatures. And then on day 6, he fills the land. He fills the land with animals, with livestock and cattle, and with all the creeping things, and a lot of the things that during the summer that bite us, and we sometimes jokingly say, I wonder why God created mosquitoes, or when we see spiders in the corners of the room, and we wonder why they're there. And instead we should just be in wonder at the vastness of God's creation. I don't like mosquitoes. And I don't like spiders. But it is quite amazing that God created things as little as mosquitoes, and even smaller than that have a purpose and fulfill a purpose in this world. He also created the lion and the elephant and the giraffe, the massive animals, from the big beasts to the little creepy things. I like the way the book put it, if I remember, all the creepy crawlies. He created those too. And before we get to what God does next on creation, I want to point out something that if you're reading through the text, you've seen multiple times. And God saw that it was good. This first happens on day 3. So you have day 1, you have God creates light. There is morning, there is evening, and that was the first day. Then you have God creates the expanse of the firmament, and again there was morning, there was evening, or evening and morning, the second day. But then on day 3, it says that God saw it, and God saw that it was good. And that's said actually twice during the events of day 3, and then it's said for days 4, days 5, and day 6. So 5 times in total, we're told that God looks upon creation and he saw that it was good. Now, when you have repetition in a story, it's there for a reason. That's one of the techniques of a storyteller. This is how I preach sometimes when I want to make an important point. I say, now listen, this is very important. And that's a really lazy, boring way to bring out something that's important, right? But another way to instill importance is repetition. When you bring up a theme again and again, when you tuck it in at just the right places, so that when someone's later thinking and they might not be able to remember all of the exact words, what's going to stick with them? What's going to stick with them is that phrase that was repeated naturally and in the right places. So if you read through this first several verses of Genesis 1, what's one of the things that would stick in your mind? And God saw that it was good. God is a good God and a good creator. And his creation is a good and a beautiful thing. But then, the special crowning point of creation. We're still on day 6, and it's apparently after the creepy crawlies and the large beasts are all created, the story alters. By this point, where there's kind of this pattern, and you kind of assume what's coming next, but on day 6 it changes. Because God doesn't just create the animals, and then there's morning, and there's evening, and there was the 6th day. Now it says, then, this begins in Genesis 1, verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. Now, chapter 2 is going to get into the details of this male-female creation, but it's summed up as all here on day 6, and this is important because man and woman are created in the image of God. Now, this is a unique part of the story. We've had all of God's creation, and so far God has said it is good. God looks at the earth as he has formed it, and it's good. And he looks at the land and the oceans, and he says, that's good. And he looks at the fish and the sea creatures and the birds and the animals, and he likes all of that. He says, it's all good. But there's something special about man, because as much as all of those other things are good, none of them are made in the image of God. But humanity, mankind, is. That word image is a really interesting word. Because you know where else it is found in scriptures? Talking about idols. The word means a statue, an idol, an image. That's something we're thinking about. Seems a little weird to say because idols are bad. But maybe this is part of why idols are so bad. Because humanity was created. And I don't think this is just in man's physical appearance, but in man's purpose, in man's role, in man's spirit. Man was created to be a representative of God. An image of God. A little living, breathing statue that looked like God. Now, that's man's purpose. And it is worth noting that every human being is an image of God. That does not mean that every human being fulfills their role of bearing the image of God. But it is every human being's responsibility. Maybe that's something you can think of through the week. When work gets tedious, you wonder, why am I doing this? When life gets hard and you wonder, what's the point? When you're frustrated and goals don't pan out, remember this. You are not just a salesman. You are not just a teacher that's banging your head against the wall. You're not just any of the many things we call ourselves. You are an image of the Almighty God. And part of your job, your main job, is to reflect His goodness and His love and His holiness. That's a bigger job than doing taxes, than preparing sermons, than any of the other things that I'm not making light of any of the work that any of us do. But our real job is to be the image of God. That's our purpose. Also, it should make us think about how we treat other people. One of the reasons that murder was condemned was because it was taking the life of someone who was created as an image bearer of God. And from the very beginning, that was a grievous offense. And you don't have to take someone's life to devalue them. When we mistreat people, when we disrespect people, when we harm people in all the various ways that we may harm them, we are hurting not just a part of God's good creation. We are hurting someone that was created to be an image bearer of God. And maybe they're not the best image bearer, but then again, I haven't perfectly been an image bearer either. None of us have. But it should make us think how much dignity and respect other people deserve because they are humans. Many of their choices may not be respectable. This is part of why we can love even our enemies, why we can pray for all men, because all are created in the image of God. We learn something else about man, and I think this is an interesting study, interesting to think about. What was man's role? And I bring some of this up because I see different discussions that take place even across the country in our brotherhood. There's different thoughts out there, and I don't want to get too far into the weeds on this, but there's ideas about, what is heaven going to be like? What is the new heavens and the new earth? That seems to be a really hot topic in religious discussions amongst some people of, is this going to be a refurbished earth that's perfect like it was when it was created? Is it all just going to be annihilated and there's something new? And people really like to discuss that, and that's fine to discuss those things. But sometimes people go back to Genesis and they try and make claims here, and some people just ignore the Genesis claims altogether. And I think we have to be careful with both. But I do think it's worth noting that when man was created, man had a purpose and man had a work. God did not place Adam in the garden to just take it easy and do nothing. Notice if you read through Genesis 1 and 2, there's several things that God said man was supposed to do. Man was to have dominion. That is to rule. Now, I will admit to you, thousands of years later, with the world that we have today, part of me wonders, what does ruling over the animal kingdom look like? Why was that such a big deal? And I don't know. But I think sometimes, and some people boil it down to that. I've listened to people that basically think man's purpose was just to be good caretakers of the animal kingdom. And I think it was bigger than that. But I think the problem is sometimes we go back to Genesis, or people go back to Genesis, and they boil all of man's role down to this, forgetting that this is the beginning. And it's almost like we make Genesis 1 and 2 the perfect goal already, and it wasn't. Was it perfect? In the sense that it was sinless, it was. But man was just starting, and man had a work to do because man was told to have dominion. Man was told to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Part of man's responsibility, Adam and Eve, was to be image bearers and to fill the earth with more image bearers. Man was told to subdue the earth. That's a troubling one to a degree. That word has the idea of forcefully conquering. What was man supposed to subdue? Man was supposed to subdue the earth. Now, when God creates the garden, it says that he placed the man in the garden, but he told him to work and keep the garden. So man had a role, he had a job to do. Now, work becomes much harder. Work becomes tedious and difficult after the fall, but even before the fall, man has a job to do. God gives man something to work with. That word keep the garden is another interesting one. It's often used as in keeping commandments. So part of man's job was to keep the garden and to obey God. Also, that word can sometimes be used as guard. In fact, when we get to Genesis 3:24, and we're told that God places an angel at the entrance to Eden, it says that he placed the angel there to guard it. It's the exact same Hebrew word as keep here. Man was supposed to work and to keep the garden. And then, of course, he was to not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So man had quite a bit to do. From the beginning, he is supposed to practice dominion, to be a ruler over this creation that is not his because he conquered it, but is his because God has given it to him. God has created this whole world. And then he tells man, you practice dominion. And you bear my image as you do. There's a lot that we can think about there, a lot we can question. There's also just a lot that I think we can just accept. This is where it started. This was man's initial purpose. Now, around here is where we find something that changes in the story also. We find the first time that God says something is not good on day 6. Again, it is good. You start day 3, it is good, it is good, it is good. And then we get to day 6 and God says, it is not good. What is it that is not good? That the man should be alone. I'm going to skip what he says next. We'll come back to it. We're going to go to what God does. God does something interesting. God gives Adam an object lesson. So God teaches. And I don't think that God created and then thought, oops, I forgot something. This could be tweaked. I think God does this purposefully. He creates Adam, but he just creates the man at first. And then we're told that God brought all the animals to Adam. And it's worded very interesting, at least in the ESV. It just makes me smile a bit. It says, God brought all the animals to Adam to see what he would name them. Almost as if God's intrigued and interested in the creative abilities of his own creation. And he brings the animals to Adam, and instead of saying, Adam, you call that a cow and you call that a lion, he says, Adam, this is your first job of subduing the earth, of practicing dominion. You are responsible for giving names to all these creatures. And so Adam does. I don't know what that day looked like. I don't know how many hours Adam sat there on his first day of existence, seeing new things, seeing those creepy crawlies come up, coming face to face with a lion and a bear, and giving names to all of these creatures. But something happens as Adam's doing this. Adam realizes these are all neat, they're beautiful, they're incredible creatures. But there's something missing. None of these really belong with him. And even in this great creation, we see that God has not created it in the absolute perfection because there's something lacking. God does this by design. And so God causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. And back up to right before that event of the animals, God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. He said, I will make him a helper fit for him. And so we're told that he causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he takes one of Adam's ribs. And from that, he fashions a woman. Why didn't God just speak into existence a woman? Maybe to make the connection between Adam and Eve. After all, he's going to say, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. We're not told the specific reason why God didn't just speak. But this, as far as I can tell, is the first time that we're told God takes something already in existence to use that as his raw materials for creating something else. So woman is very unique in the creation story. But also I want to bring our attention to this word, a helper fit for him. Some people don't like that word, but I think it's a beautiful word when it's understood correctly. God did not create a servant for man. God did not create a slave for man. God did not create an executive assistant for man. God created a helper. And if you think that the word helper is in any way demeaning, whether as a woman you think I want to be more than a helper, or as a man you think the woman is just a helper, remember this, that same word is used to describe God. In Deuteronomy 33, verse 29, it says, Happy are you, O Israel, who is like you, a people saved by the Lord, the shield of your help. Psalm 121, verses 1 and 2, I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Psalm 124, verse 8, our help is in the name of the Lord. And Hosea 13, verse 9, a warning against Israel. He destroys you, O Israel, for you are against me, against your helper. The exact same word used to describe Eve. Is God somehow our servant, our assistant, less than because he helps us? No. We rely upon God as our helper. And so when God said, I will make a helper fit for him or proper for him, God has shown Adam through this object lesson on day one that he needs more than just himself. And he will not be complete without his helper. And so the helper also needs the help of the man. But it is the two together, man and woman, that complete the creation that is humanity, the image of God. Notice, woman is to help. What is she helping him in? Well, what are all those things that man was supposed to do? Man was supposed to subdue the earth. Man was supposed to practice dominion. The woman is helping in those things. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not the liberal egalitarian view of things, I think even then there are going to be differences. God didn't just create another Adam, so hey, there's two of you, there's less work. He created woman. He created a being that was the same yet different. Different perspectives, different attitudes, different abilities and skills and talents. And together they made a complete whole. And together they could fulfill the function God called humanity to fulfill. And this leads right into marriage. At the end of chapter 2, he says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." I need to hasten on, but I'll just say this. Marriage is the first institution that God gave humanity for mankind's benefit. Take it seriously. Honor it. Cherish it. It came before government. It came before children. It came before schools. It came before, arguably, temples. Marriage. It is that important. And then it is after this, after man and woman are created, that we find not only is it good, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. It had been good already. But with humanity, with man and woman created, now creation is well-pleasing in the sight of the Creator, and it is very good. Now, I'm past, but I want to bring this up quickly and briefly, and I hesitate because it may cause more questions than answers. But I've been thinking about this. I heard something that I've been pondering on, and I want to bring this up. The seventh day. Thus, the heavens and the earth were finished, all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Why? You ever just sat and wondered, why did God rest? Back up from that, why did God take 6 days? If he is so powerful that he can literally speak this universe into existence in 6 days, surely he could have done it in 6 nanoseconds, and he could have. But he takes his time. He goes day and day and day. And then God, a being outside of time, beyond limitations, who surely needs no rest, rests. Of course, what does that mean? Does it mean that God took a nap? Does it mean he had to lay down? No, of course not. That word rest just means to cease, to stop. What is it that God did on the seventh day? God stopped his work of creation. His work of creation was finished. And so he stopped. And I think that this is one of those concepts that's rolling around in my head, and I've been having a hard time putting words to it. I don't know if you ever have that problem. But I think that really helps us understand a couple of things about Sabbath, about rest, about creation, and about eternity. And what I mean by that is God is giving us a picture of our purpose and our goal. This is something I heard the other day that I'd never picked up on. Maybe you've picked up on this. There is something different about this day than all of the other 6 days. Every other day up to this has said there was morning and evening, or evening and morning. It was the first day. The seventh day has nothing said about it. It's morning and evening. You know, if the pattern continued, there'd be morning, there'd be evening, and then we'd move on to the 8th day. But we don't. We stop here. Why is that? It would almost appear as though this day of rest is not a day of rest to recoup from the 6 days of work to get back to another 6 days of work, as some people treat the Sabbath view of the Old Testament. But it would almost be that this seventh day has no morning and evening. It is eternal. It is the goal. Work, then rest. And so when we come to the Sabbath of the Mosaic Law, because some people think that that's still binding, because it uses creation as its basis. But that was a sign given to Israel, and as so many things in the Bible are, it was a small thing to point to a bigger thing. The Sabbath day, the Sabbath years, were reminders to Israel in the midst of the fallen world that they are working for something greater than just wealth, than even just a day off work. It was a reminder in the Mosaic Law. And in Hebrews, I think we see some of this in Hebrews 4, verse 8, because they never really fully entered any rest. And I won't reteach Hebrews 4, but remember verses 8 through 11. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested in his works as God did from his. That's a key right there. God finished his work of creation and he ceased his work. He rested. He didn't cease to exist, but he ceased that work. He said, rested from his works as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. The Sabbath day and Sabbath years, they were looking forward to something. Christ fulfilled the law, and Christ gives us a hope of something to look forward to. And what is it? We are looking for that rest. And we're talking about the beginning, so I can't go to Revelation and talk about the end. But I think from the very beginning, there was a goal man was working towards. Eden was not the end. Some people think we're going back to that. There's some similarities. The tree of life shows up again. Paradise language in Revelation. I don't think we're restoring Eden. We're going towards the goal. See, because what man did, and this is getting into next week's lesson, man severely messed up the way we could get to that goal. Now, this was not a surprise to God, but man messed up his job. And that's the rest of the Bible story, fixing that. But we're still going towards that rest. And God has shown us that from the very beginning. And so, a long time ago, there was such a thing as no time at all. There was no earth, there was no sun, there were no stars, but there was God. And all of his glory and all of his power and all of his love, there was God. And then God, from his love and according to his perfect purposes, some of which we are told, some of which we cannot understand, created everything that we know, including us, humanity, the crown of his creation, made in his image, made to be living representatives of him and his glory and his love. What a special purpose God has given to us. And that's how the story begins.